just to have in mind all the people, because there's a lot of people that I know of who are in trouble with it as well. So let's just see that everybody comes in here. Okay, so for those who've just joined, Edna had asked, somebody else is coming in. Edna had asked that we have in mind some people who are battling with COVID, and I thought it's a good idea that perhaps we start by saying a kapitel Tillim, by saying a psalm together. So either repeat after me, or if you have a siddur or a Tillim handy, let's begin with Psalm 20, and perhaps just have in mind all those people who are not well, who you may know, who we don't know, who are battling with this pandemic and with this terrible illness. And please God, all of them should have a refuah shleima. They should be healed immediately and in a complete and comprehensive way. So we're going to say Psalm 20, which I will read slowly, and let's, if you wish to repeat the verses or you wish to say it from your own psalm book, please do so. Lam natseach mizmor leDavid, Yancha Adonai b'yom tzara, yisagevecha Shem Elahei Yaakov, Yishlach ezracha mikodesh, umitzion yisadeka, Yizkor kol minchesecha, v'la'asecha de'yidashne selah. Yiten lecha chilvavecha v'chol atzasecha yemalei, neranena v'shuasecha, u'v'shem Eloheinu nidgol, yemalei Adonai kol mishalesecha. Ata yadaiti ki yoshi Adonai mishichoi, yanei mishmei kodsho b'gevuras yesha yeminoi. Ele varechev, ele vasusim, v'anachnu b'shem Adonai Eloheinu naskir. Heima koru v'nafolu, v'anachnu kamenu v'anisoidad. Adonai Yeshia hamelech yaneinu v'yom koreinu. Please God, they should all have a refuah shleima in the merit of our Tehillim and our learning today on this special date. I just want to share with you something from a personal point of view, and that is that on the 8th of Shvat, which is today, I usually say Kaddish in Shul for the Yortzeit for my late grandmother. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic and due to the fact that our shuls are closed and we're not having minyanim, so I didn't say Kaddish today. So I hope that in a way our learning today will be a Kaddish in honor of my late grandmother. And if I just tell you a little bit about her very briefly, just as it's a personal share and connecting here with my good friends from this particular share. My grandmother was a woman who was born in Lithuania, came to South Africa in 1930, coming here as, it's probably the same story that all of you can tell about parents and grandparents who came to South Africa in those days. She came here at first with her two sons, sadly having lost a third son. She actually had three boys. She lost her third son in Lithuania They were from a place called Birj in Lithuania. And she came here with her two boys, one of which was my father, and then, of course, his older brother. And they arrived in South Africa. Could you imagine a woman arriving in South Africa with two boys? There are pictures of them upon arrival. Two boys, and none of them spoke one word of anything but Yiddish. They only knew Yiddish. And she arrived in Cape Town together with her sons. Eventually came up to Joburg. And only 1 year later, so a full year later, her husband joined her. He had sent the family on ahead while he tried, I think, to eke out a little bit of money in Lithuania before he came here, and then joined the family a year later. And here she was with two kids starting out in Joburg. I'll tell you that she passed away, I think now 49 years ago, but until the day she passed away, listen, she didn't speak much at all. We'll come to that in a moment. But until the day she passed away, she could not speak one word of English. She lived for those years from 1930 to her passing, which was, 1971, I think, that she lived, 1972. She lived she lived all those years not speaking one word of English. She only spoke Yiddish. And I always remember this saintly woman and the way that she was so private and so at home. She never, I hardly ever remember her going out except for sort of special occasions, but she stayed at home. White hair always. I never remember anything but just plain white hair. This was my Baba. Her name was Esther Lieber. Father's name was Eliezer, Esther Lieber, but Eliezer. And today is her Yortzeit. And I think that her not speaking was not as much of the fact that she didn't know English or never learned the language, but I think that her not speaking was the fact that everyone except her two boys and her brother, who had been in Cape Town before her, none of them actually survived the Holocaust. And so the not speaking, I guess, was, as you and I know, that people didn't talk, and they didn't, we didn't get their inner thoughts, and perhaps it led to being cut off from everybody, and perhaps it was partially a depression, maybe then undiagnosed in those days. But this was, in fact, what we sort of had as our heritage before us. In fact, it's got a lot to do with what I wanted to speak to you about today, because on this coming Shabbos, we're going to be reading Parshas Bo, where we're talking about really the real agenda is getting out of exile, getting out of Golus, getting out of these difficulties and these harshnesses and so on that our people have endured, unfortunately, from the time that we were in Mitzrayim, from the time that we were in Egypt, and then it wasn't that much different when we were in Babylon, and then it wasn't that much different under the Romans, and it wasn't that much different to what we have today, albeit that today perhaps we feel that things are a little bit better, we're a little freer in what we can and we can't do and so on. But still, we're in Golus, and still we're in exile, and still we are very hopeful of the fact that all of these things, including pandemics, will come to an end. So let's just delve a little bit into the week ahead. Let's look a little bit into the Parsha and think about the fact that this Parsha is called Parshat Bo. Bo, we all know, means come. Bo, come. Bo el Paro. Hashem says to Moshe, Bo el Paro, come to Pharaoh. He's instructed to come to Pharaoh. Bo el Paro. Our sages point out that the name Bo connotes something else as well. It's made up of two letters, a beit and an aleph, and we all know aleph and beit. Aleph bet is the letter aleph is 1, the letter bet is 2. 2 plus 1 is 3. And so by simple mathematics, in this parsha, the hint of the name is the fact that we have 3 plagues. There are the 3 final plagues that are meted out against Egypt. They are arbe, which is locusts, then choshech, which is darkness, and then makas b'choros, makat b'chorot, which is the plague of the death of the firstborn. And those 3 plagues are visited upon Egypt. And it's then that the Jewish people are actually freed or pushed out of Egypt. They have the opportunity to leave. The 3 plagues of Bo are the 3 final strikes of the hammer, the 3 final plagues that are visited upon the Egyptians and give us our liberty. Now, it's something that we hear over and over again at our Pesach Seder, where we delve into these plagues and we rattle them off sometimes and we say, these are the plagues, and that's the time that you dip with the wine or you spill off a little bit of wine, and we go through the dam, tzfardeya, kinim, orev, dever, shchin, makas, b'choros, all the way through all those plagues, and we're going through each one of them, and we in fact enumerate them, but perhaps we don't always delve into actually what was unique and special and significant about these plagues. And I'm not going to point out all the significances, and we're not going to go into each one, but perhaps just to look a little bit at one plague, and that is the plague of darkness. Darkness. What happened in this plague of darkness? The Torah is very specific, but as we go into the specifics of the plague, it's not that easy to, I suppose because it's darkness, but it's not that easy to tell the wood from the trees. It's not that easy to really understand exactly what this plague was really all about. So what was the plague? How did it work? The plague of darkness, Torah tells us specifically, was a thick darkness that came upon the Egyptians. And the Torah tells us that this was a thick darkness, and the expression that is used in the parsha is that this thick darkness meant that a man could not see his neighbor, could not see his brother. And there's another detail that says that the people could not move. They could not move from their places. They were stuck to their seats. And it then goes on and tells us, but the Jewish people had light. There was light wherever the Jews were. Now, the various different sages take a look at this plague, and they unpack it in the following way. They tell us that, in fact, there were 2 phases to the plague. Phase number 1 was a certain level of darkness, and that is referring to the fact that a person couldn't see his brother. Plague number 2, or part of the plague number 2, or the phase number 2 of the plague, was that the people couldn't move. And they say that number 1, the plague was darkness that disabled the ability for people to see, and they couldn't see each other. And it's specific. It talks about seeing people who were close to them, their brothers, recognizing them. And the second part was that it became thick. It wasn't just something visual, but in fact, it was as though they were in straitjackets. They were bound to their places. They couldn't move. It was something that held them in space. Can you imagine some sort of darkness that was coupled with a magnetic field that made it that it was impossible to move? The people, the Egyptians, were unable to move. And the Torah then sort of casually gives us that next line and says, but the whole Jewish people, every Jew, Kol Yisrael, Chol Yisrael, every single Jew had or b'mishvosam, they had light in their places and wherever they were. Now, let's unpack it one step at a time. The idea of not seeing your neighbor. Now, we have something fascinating. If you take a look in the Mishnah in Brachot, where we're talking about our brachas that we make every single day, the Mishnah starts off and talks about the prayers that we say on a daily basis, and particularly the times of Kriyat Shema, of the reading of the Shema, Kriyat Shema, the reading of the Shema. And we know that it tells us that the Shema has to be read in the morning, and the Shema has to be read in the evening. Twice a day, we must read this Shema, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and the verses, the paragraphs that follow thereafter, they are read twice a day. When do we read them? So here we have a discussion about when these things are read. What time frame do we have to read them? So if you ask anybody who knows anything about prayer, they'll tell you that the first Shema in the morning needs to be read early in the morning before a certain time, and that time fluctuates. Well, how do we determine those times? And then, by the way, the evening one, they say that's got to be read after a certain time, and some say before midnight, or others say until the Alot HaShachar, until it starts getting light in the morning. But let's park that for a moment. Let's just think about the daytime Shema. The daytime Shema, we're told, needs to be read it's got to be read at the time, uveshochbecha uvekumecha, we say. It's got to be read at the time that you lie down and the time that you get up. So when do we get up? So they say different people get up at different times. If we would do a survey of the people who are on this particular Zoom call, on this particular shir, and you ask, what time do you get up in the morning? Well, there's possibly a bandwidth. There's probably an amount of time, if we took the earliest to the latest. So somebody will say, you know what, I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. And somebody else will say, I get up at 6. And somebody else will say 7. Somebody else will say 8. And some who like to shlof a little bit might say, I get up at 9. The Torah says, so is that relative to you yourself? Do you say that Shema can be said whenever you wake up? And that's certainly an opinion in the way that it's structured. But they say no. The idea of a kumecha, of you getting up, has got to do with a time frame. And they phrase it as follows. They say, people who are laborers, who are peasants, who need to get up and what do they say? Make hay while the sun is shining. They have to get up with the first light. And people who are perhaps royalty or perhaps wealthy people who can sleep in and have servants who do all the other work for them, they would usually get up at a certain time much later in the morning. And they peg it at that. They say, what is the average earliest that a person would get up? And what is the average latest that a person would get up? And that's in fact determined as the time frame. And they say, well, it's in the first quarter of the day, that from before it gets light until the first quarter of the day, that's usually the bandwidth. But that's just one opinion. There's another opinion that tells us that you can only start saying the Shema from the time you can tell the difference between green and white, between blue and white. I'm sure that this is where it comes from, that blue and white are the Jewish colors and the colors of the Israeli flag and so on. Blue and white is mentioned specifically in the Mishnah as two colors. Now, you and I know that if you took dark blue and you took white and you put them next to each other, if you looked at them in not such good light, it would have to be, it could get quite dark before you would be able to say, I can't tell the difference between blue and white. Another opinion is no, it must be the difference between blue and green. What's the difference between blue and green? Well, if you take a look at Shamayim, you see blue. The earth, while it's known as the blue planet, it actually is rather green. And so there's earth and heaven, and you've got to be able to tell the difference between heaven and earth at the time that you say the Shema. So you can't be schloffing, and you can't be in a state whereby you don't know the difference between up and down and between heaven and earth. You've got to be able to determine these differences. And when you can determine the difference between heaven and earth, that's maybe a time that you can say the Shema. There is another opinion, and that is that a person has to be able to say the Shema. He's got to be able to recognize his friend. Recognize your friend. You can say the Shema when you can recognize your friend. Doesn't say when you can recognize another person. It says when you can recognize your friend or your brother. Now, it's a similar language that's used here. It says that the people in Egypt, the Egyptians, couldn't recognize, or they couldn't see their friends. They couldn't see their brothers. They couldn't see the people who are close to them. What's it taken from in a halachic point of view is that we're not talking about you being able to recognize a stranger. We're talking about you being able to recognize somebody who's closer to you. Somebody who's closer to you means that it also doesn't have to be that light. If with a little bit of light, you could see somebody who's close to you. But it's taken, of course, to mean something really, really much, much deeper than that. And that is that you cannot daven to God when you can't recognize your fellow man. And in fact, in many Sidurim, including, of course, in the Chabad Siddur designed by the Alter Rebbe, Rebbe Shneur Zalman of Liadi, he placed in the Siddur that before we start our morning prayers, we actually have to say, Hareini mekabel alai mitzvat aseh shel ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Before I start praying, I need to take upon myself, and I take upon myself, that I want to make sure that I can and I will perform the mitzvah of loving my fellow man as myself. Because what is the use of davening to God, or can we even bring ourselves to daven to God, when we cannot recognize our fellow man? Now, we all know that the plagues that were visited upon the Egyptians were midah keneged midah. They were things that were brought against them, not only to teach them a lesson, and not only to give them a clap, but the plagues that were visited upon the Egyptians were to teach them something that they had been that they'd not performed, that they had been reluctant to perform, or that they perhaps had not done at all. And one of them was that they cared not for anybody else. Egyptian society was all the time only looking out for themselves. They couldn't give two hoots about anybody else. Never mind about the Jews, but the Egyptians didn't give two hoots about their fellow Egyptians either. In fact, if we look very carefully at the wording of Torah later on, where we talk about, earlier on rather, where we talk about the casting of the boys into the Nile, that wasn't just Jewish boys, that was Egyptian boys as well. All firstborn, whether they were Egyptian or they were Jewish, had to be tossed into the Nile. And the Egyptians really, they couldn't care less. So another kid, who cares? They had that kind of a lack of empathy and a lack of concern. It was almost a whole society of psychopaths who had absolutely no empathy and no feeling for anybody else. This is what we're talking about here. The darkness of the plague made it that they couldn't see their fellow men. Why? Because they never saw their fellow men. They didn't see the pain. They didn't see the suffering. They couldn't care about their fellow men. They had no qualms whatsoever if their fellow men were suffering, certainly not about Jews, but even not about their fellow men, their fellow Egyptians. And so Torah says, so this plague came to make sure that they couldn't see their fellow men, that they realized that 1 second, if you can't see somebody physically, you certainly can't see them emotionally, and you certainly can't see them spiritually. And that was the first part of this plague. The second part of this plague was that they were unable to move. In fact, Rashi and other Mefarshim tell us that the plague was divided along day lines, that in fact the first part was for 3 days and the second part was for another 3 days, that for 3 days they couldn't see and for another 3 days they couldn't move. Now, not being able to move, movement is something that we sometimes also take for granted. And if we think about it, everything that Torah instructs us to do demands some kind of a movement. We've got to be able to move. Now, we're not only here talking about physical movement. We're talking about a movement in our spirituality, growth, upward movement, a movement of development, a movement of the action. If you think about it, any mitzvah of Torah demands some kind of an action. We can't only give tzedakah in our minds, we've got to do the action. We can't only light candles for Shabbos in our minds, we've got to do the action. We can't only care for other people in our minds, we've got to do something about it. So the action was taken away from them. And why? Because once again, they were a people who were inactive when it came to spiritual growth, when it came to caring for others. They were completely and absolutely inactive. So their ability to be active was completely taken away from them. They were frozen. They were stuck to their seats. They couldn't move. They couldn't go anywhere. This was how thick and how powerful this darkness actually was. Now, Torah then juxtaposes this and tells us, but the whole Jewish people had light. What does that mean? So it doesn't only mean that the whole Jewish people had light as in the ability to see, but it clearly must mean that the whole Jewish people also had the opposite of what the Egyptians were smitten with. That the Jewish people were shown how important it was to see your brother. That the Jewish people were shown how important it was and it is to be active, how important it is to be a person and a personality, an individual and a community of action, that there are things that we've got to do and that it's demanded from us to show that our true liberation, our true liberty that we gained when we got out of Mitzrayim, that we got out of Egypt, enabled us, A, to be able to see our brothers, and it enabled us, B, to be able to step into action, to do things in an active fashion, making sure that our mitzvahs are done and that our upward growth spiritually and our ability to be givers to the entire world, these are all things that we had to subscribe to, that saw to it that we were redeemed from Mitzrayim, that we got out of Egypt, and they certainly are things that we were asked and instructed to do once we gained that liberty. Liberty, freedom, our exodus from Egypt was on the back of the ability to see each other and on the back of the ability to actually do things, to be active, not only in a spiritual sense, but in a practical and a physical sense as well. Now, on this coming Shabbos, the Chabad community commemorates a date called Yud Shvat. Yud Shvat is the 10th day of Shvat. I told you today's the 8th, my Baba's yahrzeit. Yud Shvat is the yahrzeit of two great individuals in Chabad history, and that is number one, the Rebbetzin Rivka. The Rebbetzin Rivka was the wife of what we call the Rebbe Maharash, the Rebbe Shmuel, who was Rebbe a few Rebbes ago, and she, Rebbetzin Rivka, outlived her husband by 33 years, and during that time, the Hasidim used to spend a lot of time going to hear her relating stories and things that happened in the past in Lubavitch. She became this incredible powerhouse of customs and stories and background to the Chabad Hasidic movement. Her name was Rivka. And today, throughout the Chabad community worldwide, the name Rivka is very often a name given to women's houses of learning. Beit Rivka, the whole Beit Rivka school system was named after this Rebbetzin Rivka. And she passed away on Yud Shvat many years ago. Now, her grandson became the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchok Schneerson. We refer to him as the Friedika Rebbe. We refer to him as the previous Rebbe. This Rabbi Yosef Yitzchok Schneerson, the previous Rebbe, was the Rebbe of Chabad through the war years, the Second World War, although he took over the leadership of the community a lot earlier. He was a powerhouse of an individual who stood up against the communists and probably almost single-handedly fought a spiritual battle against communism in Russia at a time when others folded and didn't want to, and whatever. The previous Rebbe endured a tremendous amount of suffering and pain and torture and so on at the hands of the communists for the standing up against them, and eventually re-established his institutions in Warsaw, where he was whisked out of there in the early 1940s and came to America. He was a physically broken, was confined to a wheelchair, and had terrible pain and suffering that he had endured. And he passed away in New York in 1950. 1950, on Yud Shvat, he actually passed away on his own grandmother's yahrzeit, which was Yud Shvat. It's coming up on this Shabbos. And at the time of his passing, of course, he was succeeded by his famous son-in-law, the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who became the Rebbe when his father-in-law passed away. But in fact, for the full year, until his father-in-law's yahrzeit, which was Yud Shvat in 1951, the Rebbe himself did not accede to the many requests and the pointed fingers of the fact that you have to be the Rebbe and you have to take over. Of course, the Rebbe felt always mentioned that his father-in-law was the Rebbe and is the Rebbe. He never referred to himself as the leader, the Rebbe himself. But the Rebbe's tenure as Lubavitcher Rebbe began in earnest in 1951, although practically speaking, it was from the moment that the previous Rebbe passed on, which was on Yud Shvat in 1950. And so, in fact, if you think about it now, we are at year number 71 since the previous Rebbe passed away, or year number 70, exactly, with 70th anniversary of the Rebbe this Yud Shvat, this Shabbos, the 70th anniversary of the Rebbe taking over as Rebbe. And that being the case, it is what Hasidim all over the world will be doing over this weekend particularly, is thinking about the Rebbe and what he did for us and what he taught us and what he gave us, and how many beautiful anecdotes and stories, and through all of those things, how the Rebbe left us with this incredible legacy of Chabad worldwide, and the incredible exponential growth during the rest of the Rebbe's lifetime, which was up until 1994. And from then on, where it's actually grown in leaps and bounds, where perhaps one would have said in 1994 that the whole Chabad Lubavitch movement per se could have and should have on paper come to an end. On the contrary, it grew in leaps and bounds and became even bigger than ever before. So I would like to share with you an anecdote, a story. And this is a story that I read recently, which kind of typifies something very special about the Rebbe. And perhaps, I hope I can show links back to what I told you in the beginning about being able to see your brother. So the story is as follows. It's written by a Rabbi Newman. Rabbi Newman, who tells the story of how he was a child in the time of the Second World War. And many of the children, and particularly a group that he was with, wound up in an orphanage in France, in Paris. They were in this orphanage, and the kids in the orphanage were all kids who had run away from Europe. And this was now in the late 1930s, shortly before the war. And he writes that as children in this orphanage, they had very, very little to look forward to. And they all had lost and didn't know what had happened to their families. And perhaps much like my late grandmother, they didn't speak that much, but they did cry a lot, and they cried a lot at night. And the scenes in the orphanage were horrible and difficult. And while the orphanage saved their lives, they had a miserable existence there. And he says, but there was an individual who used to come and visit every day. And he remembers very clearly that this individual who came to visit, they called Monsieur. Monsieur, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. My French is not that good. I never professed to be a French speaker. I don't know much French at all. But Monsieur, they called him Monsieur. Sir, Mr. And he describes how this young man used to come and bring food, special food. And he speaks about these French loaves of bread that he would bring and distribute to the children. And he would sometimes, he says, sit on the floor and try and persuade the children to eat a little bit more. He gave them food, he asked them to eat, and when he could, he would bring them other vegetables, and he would bring potatoes, and he would bring them fruit and so on. Whatever he could bring, this man as an outsider, they saw him as a volunteer, came, sat with the kids, gave them food to eat, and they loved, and they grew to love Monsieur. And he would speak to the kids. And one by one, as he would put his arm around the child, he would encourage them that all hope is not lost, and you have a future. And he would say words of encouragement and kindness, and that he was, for most of them, a shoulder to cry on, and they looked forward to his daily visits, and they loved Monsieur. And then the war happened, and paths split up, and he never saw him again. And he, as a rabbi, became a rabbi, I think in America somewhere, went on to yeshiva, became a rabbi. And then one day, he was taken to see the Lubavitcher Rebbe in New York. He was given the opportunity for a yechidus to go into a private interview together with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And this rabbi's first name was David. His name was David Newman. And he said he waited in line. And as people did then, they would say Tehillim, they would prepare themselves spiritually. And he joined the queue and waited his turn to go into Yechidus with the Rebbe. And he said he'll never forget, as the door opened and he was ushered in when his turn came, this elderly rabbi who was sitting behind the desk looked up at him and said to him, Davidul, is that you? And he couldn't believe it. How does he know my name? He's calling me Davidul, affectionate. David, how does he know my name? And he said, as the Rebbe raised his head and looked at him, he looked at him and he said, Monsieur, that's you. And he realized that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was this man who had brought these bread loaves and had sat on the floor with the children and encouraged them in the orphanage and gave them a will to live. And he said, he remembered Monsieur, and he said to him, you have no idea that those visits actually saved our lives. And that the visit of a person who just told children in an orphanage in Paris in the 1930s that he cared enough to visit them and to inspire them and to bring them little bits of food, that saved their lives. It gave them a hope, and it gave them a will, and it gave them a vision of the future. It gave them the ability to live. And he said the remarkable thing that he walked out of there thinking, and at that moment he thought, isn't it amazing that the Rebbe recognized me before I recognized him? He recognized me before I recognized him. And isn't that what we're talking about when we talk about this idea of being able to see your neighbor? And we've got to remember that the Jewish people were granted that ability in Egypt because it is of paramount importance that we should be able to recognize our neighbors before they recognize us. What do I mean? We've got to be able to see others before we actually see ourselves, or before we expect anything back for ourselves. Is this not one of the important messages behind this story of Rabbi Newman, the Rebbe, and what Yud Shvat is actually all about? If the Lubavitcher Rebbe gave us anything, he gave us an insight into the idea of recognizing the worth of every individual, the idea of recognizing the worth of every person everywhere. I have regaled you before with the story of Hanukkah, that the Rebbe asked my father to ensure that Hanukkah menorahs were lit for prisoners in the Pretoria Central Prison. I've told you that story before, but that too means, or is, the Rebbe is looking at people in their hardest times and recognizing that they have worth. It gave them encouragement. It gave them inspiration. They had something to look forward to. And so perhaps if we just think about, in honor of Yud Shvat, two important messages. Message number one is, let's make sure we always recognize our fellow man. And message number two is, let's make sure that we are always active in making sure that we can get up from our chairs. We can get up from what we're doing and we can do for others. We can make sure that our action is of paramount importance, not only to ourselves, but it's of paramount importance to others as well. And then we've grasped and we've understood, I think, what the redemption from Egypt was actually all about. Yes, what these last plagues were all about, to teach the Egyptians that, and on the flip side, to teach us the value of what we had and we have and we're gifted with. But we have a job and we have an opportunity and we have an instruction and we have a valuable life's lesson of the fact that each and every one of us needs to make sure we always recognize our neighbors. We always recognize our brothers and sisters. We always recognize and see the worth and the value in them. And at the same time, we've got to do something about it. And that doing something about it is our mitzvahs. That doing something about it is actually helping to prepare ourselves and the world and our neighbors for the Geula, for the redemption. Remember, very soon after the plague of darkness, the Jewish people got out of Egypt. Please God, very soon after the mentioning of these plagues on this Shabbos, we will get out of this Egypt, of this Mitzrayim, of this Golus. Please God, it will happen very, very soon with the coming of Mashiach. And hopefully, listen, it can't come a day sooner, but hopefully we'll also get the message just as an added plus here of what we're being called upon to do during the second wave of COVID-19. And I've got a feeling that a lot of people have not yet heeded the real message. If you take a look at the news reports and things that people are talking about and so on, we haven't yet heeded the message. The message of COVID-19 is not about me, but it's about others. Why do I have to isolate? It's not to protect me, to protect other people. Why do I have to wear a mask? I see some people wearing their masks diligently while they're listening to the shir. Because clearly in spaces with other people, I've got to protect other people. This is not about me, it's about others. Why couldn't I say Kaddish today for my Baba? It's not about me, it's about others. It's about making sure that other people don't, God forbid, contract this illness, get sick, and that we're not spreading it to other people. We've got to make sure that we can keep our focus on seeing our brothers, on seeing others. And if we've got that message and that message alone from this week's Parsha, well, then it's certainly all been worthwhile. So I want to wish you a great Shabbos. I want to wish you a beautiful time up ahead. And please God, next week, our shir falls on Tu B'Shvat, on the 15th of Shvat. So we'll address that topic then. Take care and have a good Shabbos. I don't know how I'm supposed to do this. Let's see if I can unmute everybody, mute all, invite all. There we go. I think you can unmute yourselves. Can you? Trying to give you an opportunity to say hello. Allow participants to unmute themselves. Yes. Yes.
Rabbi Katz?
Yep. There we go. Okay.
You know about Larry Schulman?
No.
He's got COVID very badly.
Oh my gosh. Listen, unfortunately, I've heard about so many people who have it. It's right now we can't be too careful. It's really, really, it's terrible at the moment within the Jewish community. We've got to be so careful. Please, everybody, take care. Please be safe, and please, let's not be too clever. It can spread not at a moment's notice, but a milli-moment's notice. And let's please be careful. We wish everybody who you know who's not well, we wish them all well.
Thank you for your gift to you. Thank you, Rebbe.
Thank you, Rebbe. Good Shabbos.
Take care.
Good Shabbos to everybody.
You too, Felicity.
Thanks, Rabbi, and save yourself.